This is Troy Donahue, and I've got a secret.
In the 1960s, Troy Donahue was once the Prince of Dreams for millions of young American women. Yet hidden behind his elegant appearance and the clean-cut image he portrayed on screen was a life quietly enduring pain and drowning in darkness, something almost no one knew about. In 1990, Hollywood was shaken when Donahue appeared in an interview and openly revealed that he had secretly dated five of the most famous male actors of the time. Among them was a man considered the ultimate embodiment of American masculinity. Someone who was not only the idol Donahue deeply admired, but also the very person who wounded him to the core. There were those who even pulled him into a life of addiction, pushing him to the brink of despair, where he more than once felt like giving up on everything. So, which names had crossed paths with Troy Donahue, and who among them had driven him into such a deep pit of hopelessness that he could almost never climb back out? With just his role as the young man in A Summer Place, Donahue instantly shot to fame, becoming a phenomenon. Warner Brothers heavily promoted him as a national star, and his image was splashed across the covers of every teen magazine. But by the late 1960s, as the cinematic trend shifted from romantic love stories to edgier, rebellious characters, Donahue's classic gentleman persona quickly became outdated. Hollywood gradually pushed him to the sidelines. His contracts were terminated, and his roles grew fewer and fewer until they completely dried up. Unable to bear the crushing pressure of being forgotten, Donahue plunged into alcohol and became addicted to heroin and cocaine. He once admitted that he would drink from morning until night, and the addictions ravaged both his health and his finances, forcing him to seek help from Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1968, Donahue declared bankruptcy and lost his home. That same year, Warner Brothers' termination of his contract turned a superstar into an unemployed man overnight. He was forced to sleep in his car with no money for food, surviving on the kindness of old friends from the entertainment industry. All four of his marriages eventually fell apart. To fill the unnameable voids in his life, Donahue sought out relationships that had never made it into the press. Some faces were mentioned only in hushed tones behind the curtains of Hollywood, tied to bitter secrets that had never once been revealed. One, Rock Hudson, a love refugee. Amid the glamorous deception, Troy Donahue first met Rock Hudson on a fateful afternoon in the office of Hollywood's powerful kingmaker, Henry Wilson. At the time, Donahue was just a young man sitting quietly, withdrawn in a corner of the room, flipping through the pages of a script while his mind lingered on the nagging worry of how he would come up with the rent he still couldn't manage to pay. Suddenly, the door swung open. From the hallway outside came the excited cheers of fans. Rock Hudson walked in, tall, imposing, calm in demeanor, casually removing his sunglasses and then his hat, the corner of his lips lifting into a slight, slanted smile. He appeared before Donahue's eyes like a living, breathing god of cinema. In that very moment, Donahue cried out silently in his mind. My God, that can't be a real man. That's a statue of a god stepping right out of the silver screen. He even leaned slightly toward a nearby assistant and whispered, Someday, I wanted to be as famous as he is. But what left Donahue breathless was not just Hudson's dazzling appearance. It was his eyes. They held a look that was both searching and guarded, carrying an unshakable tension, as if trying to hide a deep and dangerous secret. Later, Donahue would recall, I looked at Rock standing there, and I knew right away he was living behind a mask, just like the one I had only begun to wear. From that moment, something bloomed between them. Or more precisely, a kind of bond that went far beyond the boundaries of ordinary love. They never once dared to hold hands in public. No photograph of them together exists. No words of affection were ever spoken in front of others. But in the darkness of a room, after long, exhausting days on set, with only the sound of liquor pouring into glasses blending with the soft notes of jazz, Hudson would finally let himself relax, just enough for Donahue to lean in and whisper, We are people who are not allowed to exist fully. The two often left handwritten letters for each other on the dressing table, written in purple ink and folded into triangles, a secret sign to avoid discovery. Once, Donahue received a note that contained only a single sentence. I dreamed of Paris, no paparazzi, no lights, just us, hand in hand. But that dream was quickly strangled by Hollywood. For weeks, a paparazzo quietly tailed Donahue, until finally capturing the shot that would change everything. A tall man in a gray overcoat, broad-shouldered and unmistakable. That was Rock Hudson. Walking beside him, head bowed, hands deep in the pockets of a long coat. That was Troy Donahue. Hudson raised his hand to shield the lens, while Donahue turned his face away, but not quickly enough. Those photos were sent straight to Warner Brothers as blackmail material. Warner Brothers reacted instantly. Donahue was summoned and forced to sign a pledge to maintain an absolutely heterosexual image, under threat of immediate contract termination for any further violation. As for Hudson, he was ordered to get married. The chosen bride was his own assistant, Phyllis Gates. The sham marriage lasted 3 years, just enough to placate public opinion and protect his image. From then on, they drifted apart. Both knew that a single misstep would bring everything crashing down. Donahue once confided to a co-star, He's the icon. I'm just the rough draft, and neither of us can live as our true selves. Hudson continued playing his role, not just on screen, but in life itself, until he was diagnosed with late-stage AIDS in 1984. Only then did he finally speak publicly about his true sexuality, but by that time, it was far too late. And Donahue? When the lights went out, he sank into alcohol, depression, and years of living out of his car after bankruptcy. Yet even near the end of his life, whenever Hudson's name came up, there was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet tone as he said, "If I could choose again, I'd still want to touch him, even just once." And Hudson, though he held such a special place in Donahue's heart, was not the only one to leave a deep scar there. At another time, in another place, there was also someone else who turned his life upside down. 2. Anthony Perkins, the forbidden love, and the shocking act of defiance. Anthony Perkins was the very first name to step into the bitter, pain-laden chapters of Troy Donahue's life. Their fateful meeting took place at a party in the late 1950s. At that time, Troy Donahue had just emerged as the new, dreamy heartthrob under the Warner Brothers banner, while Anthony Perkins, after his legendary portrayal of Norman Bates, had already been hailed as an icon of American cinema. Yet his eyes carried the deep, shadowed melancholy of a soul in constant turmoil. In early 1957, Perkins and Donahue spent several consecutive weeks living together in a villa in Rome, sharing ordinary daily moments and even appearing together on the program Jukebox Jury. However, the relationship existed only in the shadows. They met in the apartments of friends they could truly trust, drove to the beach at 2 in the morning, and parked far from the main road just to avoid the prying eyes of gossip reporters. "We could never walk side by side in public," Donahue recalled in a husky voice. "We always had to put on an act. We always had to pretend." For Donahue, Anthony Perkins was something entirely different. Gentle, yet harboring an unpredictable undercurrent of instability. Donahue said that Perkins was often haunted by nightmares in which he was being pursued and had to flee from demons. One night, in the middle of his sleep, Perkins bolted upright in a cold sweat and whispered softly, "If they find out, I'll lose everything." Perkins even trembled as he recounted how a guitar had once advised him to undergo therapy because he showed deviant tendencies. But Hollywood at the time had absolutely no place for a romance between two men. When Paramount caught wind of rumors about Perkins and Donahue, studio head Barney Balaban immediately demanded that Perkins end the relationship. He threatened, "If you don't listen, we will cancel your contract on the spot." In response, Anthony Perkins erupted in anger, shouting, "But I love him," before slamming the door and storming out of Balaban's office without the slightest hesitation. Soon afterward, Barney Balaban made his move. In 1959, the studio separated them, forcing each man onto different film sets, driving an even greater wedge into an already fragile bond. The relationship lasted only 3 or 4 years before collapsing, crushed under the combined weight of career pressures and Paramount's authority, which compelled them to choose their professions over their love. More than half a century later, Troy Donahue is still remembered as a symbol of radiant youth, and Anthony Perkins as a genius at embodying the roles of madmen. Over the next 3 decades, the two rarely crossed paths. According to Hunter, they met only a few times. Once, while working together on the life and times of Judge Roy Bean in 1971. And another time when Donahue visited the Perkins family in 1984. They never had the chance to reconcile, and whatever love remained was gradually eroded by the passage of time. It was a beautiful romance, yet one born into an era that could never accept it, and that perhaps was the greatest tragedy of all. However, Donahue and Perkins were far from the only lonely souls caught in Hollywood's merciless machinery. Somewhere else on the grand stage, another lover was also living a life of constant flight from his own heart. 3 Grover Dale, saving a soul, then drowning it in despair. Beneath the dazzling lights of the stage, where every movement was paid for with sweat and passion, the name Grover Dale echoed like a legend. A gifted dancer, a remarkable actor, and a choreographer once nominated for a Tony Award for his role in West Side Story. Grover Dale had once been the lover of Anthony Perkins, the famous loner forever linked with the image of Norman Bates in Psycho. The two had lived together in a small apartment in New York. But then, when Perkins chose to take a different path and marry a woman, Dale was left behind with a shattered heart and a void nothing could fill. And then he met Troy Donahue. By that time, Donahue was no longer the dashing matinee idol of a summer place. He had become a homeless drifter, quietly wandering the streets of Sunset Boulevard, eking out an existence in an old car, battling alcoholism and the tattered remnants of his once glorious days. They crossed paths one cold, rainy night at the end of the year under a bridge near Beverly Hills. Donahue, gaunt, eyes bloodshot, huddled inside a faded coat. Dale, fresh from a dance rehearsal, stopped in his tracks when that desperate gaze silently held on to him. From that moment, love began to creep in. They sought each other out in quiet corners backstage, in evenings spent listening to old jazz records and sipping red wine. Grover Dale and Troy Donahue guarded every moment fiercely, making sure no paparazzi could trace a hint of their connection. They shared hurried kisses behind the curtain, secret hand squeezes beneath the dressing table, and aimless midnight drives to the beach, only to end up crying together. It was not exactly a love affair, more like an escape. But the inevitable eventually came. Anita Morris, Dale's wife, traced the clues and uncovered the truth. She issued an ultimatum. Either come back and be my husband, or I'll expose everything. In a panic, Dale chose to retreat. The relationship ended in silence, even as Donahue tried to hold on. To fill the emptiness, Troy Donahue turned back to hard liquor. Each time he got drunk, he would write Grover's name on the back of old receipts, talk to himself, force a hollow smile in front of the mirror, and murmur, "He was the last person who ever looked at me like I was human." He sank deeper into addiction, losing his home and his family. For years, Donahue lived hidden away in an old truck parked in a lot on the outskirts of Los Angeles, scribbling diary entries in pencil on the inside walls, preserving the memories of Grover Dale. It was not until the final roll of his life that he touched a sliver of light again. Francis Ford Coppola, an old classmate, invited him back to the screen. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Troy Donahue once more stood under the lights, carrying the presence of a man who was truly alive. As for Grover Dale, he left the glamour of performing behind, becoming a creative director and founding the website Answers for Dancers, a place to help young artists nurture their dreams. But for those who had known him, there would always be an unnamed chapter in Dale's life, the chapter of a blond man who once waited beneath a bridge, hands trembling as he clutched a record and 2 bottles of red wine. Grover Dale was a long, aching chapter, but not the final one. Because there are some people who leave not promises, but wounds. And the next handsome actor in his life would be one of them. 4. Tab. Hunter. From adversary to lover, and the secrets behind the first glance. In the 1950s and 1960s, Troy Donahue and Tab Hunter were two faces meticulously groomed by Warner Brothers, transformed into the ideal Hollywood archetype. Tall, handsome, debonair, and exuding the image of perfect heterosexual masculinity. Both were once counted among the ranks of silver screen heartthrobs. But as the era of the classic male icon passed, their careers began to stall and gradually decline. At first, they felt little affection for each other. Tab Hunter considered Troy Donahue far too loud. At a backstage party, he coldly dropped a remark that silenced the entire room. Hollywood doesn't need another handsome but empty-headed guy. The comment made Donahue blush in front of the crowd. From that moment on, they continuously argued about films, lifestyles, and what they called artistic values, even coming close to a physical altercation right in the middle of the party. Yet somehow, something changed. Just one glance, one touch, made their hearts stir in unison. When the cameras were no longer watching, they began driving together to deserted coastal areas. One night, close to 1 a.m., Tab Hunter appeared at Donahue's apartment carrying an old jazz record and 2 bottles of red wine. "Tonight, you don't have to pretend," Hunter whispered. That night, they shared an intense, passionate embrace and forgot to lock the door. Only a few hours later, strange noises echoed down the hallway. A paparazzo had sneaked in and used a flash-equipped camera to capture every private moment of the two of them. The very next morning, both Hunter and Donahue disappeared from all events. Donahue was summoned to the studio executive's office and endured 3 hours of non-stop scolding, accompanied by the warning that all contracts would be terminated and he would disappear from Hollywood if he repeated the offense. For Hunter, the situation was even harsher. Warner Brothers immediately assigned him to a new project, relocated him to a studio in another state, rearranged his entire media schedule, and required him to appear alongside a female star at a press conference. That was how the studio managed their relationship. Although forced to keep their romance secret, Donahue could not escape jealousy. Every time he saw Hunter with an actress, he would make bitterly sarcastic jokes. "He acts better than anyone I have ever met." But behind the glossy magazine photos, both shared the same aching loneliness. Later, reflecting on that love, Tab Hunter admitted, "I lived 2 lives, one private life I could not speak of, and one screen life that had been prearranged. Eventually, this hidden romance had to end." To maintain his contracts, Donahue was forced to play a man in love with women, even marrying Suzanne Plachette in 1964. But the whirlwind marriage lasted only 8 months. In one interview, he confessed that he had been forced to become America's love icon, and that most of his relationships with women had been orchestrated by Warner Brothers. As for Hunter, he was compelled to sign image protection contracts, strictly forbidding any public relationships with men. It was not until 2005, more than 10 years after leaving Hollywood, that Tab Hunter officially came out in his memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential. After years of silence, Hunter finally found an open and lasting love. He married Alan Glazer, his life partner of 35 years. Their story was recreated in the documentary Tab Hunter Confidential, receiving widespread praise from the LGBTQ community. By contrast, Troy Donahue, his former lover, passed away after 2 consecutive heart attacks. Tab Hunter found light after years of living behind a facade. But not everyone was so fortunate. Some people, seemingly saved by love, were ultimately drowned by it, with no way out. 5. Chad Everett. A one-night affair that drove Troy Donahue into darkness. In the dim light of the Warner Brothers soundstage, Chad Everett, a man with a handsome face, a warm, deep voice, and a distinguished appearance, was once regarded as America's sweetheart. Millions of women were captivated by him and admired his 4-decade-long marriage to Shelby Grant. Yet behind that dazzling curtain of fame existed an entirely different world, a world that only Troy Donahue had ever stepped into. They met in their youth, during a time when both were still struggling amid the spotlight and their own personal ambitions. Their first encounter took place on a film set. Chad, disciplined, cold, and controlling. Donahue, reckless, rebellious, yet yearning to be loved. Their meetings were coded with small notes tucked into scripts, a tie worn backward, or a line of dialogue deliberately spoken offbeat. After shooting wrapped, Chad would leave first, while Donahue followed, keeping a distance of 3 cross streets. They would retreat to a rented room by the hour, where Donahue played loud music to drown out their rapid breaths. Even after Chad Everett had married, he continued to seek out Donahue. He rented an apartment far from the center, took off his neatly tailored suit, and allowed Donahue to touch him as if liberating a trapped soul. Yet even in these intimate moments, Chad maintained his role. He remained in control, dominant, never letting his true emotions cross the line. Every kiss was like a command, and every time he left, the one left crying behind the door was always Donahue. Shelby Grant knew everything. From the earliest days of their marriage, she understood that Chad Everett was a man of the public. Some nights, she would lie alone in their mansion, listening to the familiar engine sound as Chad drove into the night to meet his lover. But Shelby would smile softly, never scream. She quietly erased every trace, even handling photographers herself at times, then appeared before the press with a radiant smile. "My husband is perfect." She was intelligent enough to understand that she didn't need Chad's heart. She only needed to maintain the image of the ideal family, a powerful tool for producers when promoting their projects. On a cold September night, Donahue left a handwritten note beside a silver lighter, a gift from Chad. He had endured enough. Chad wanted everything to follow a pattern. A perfect marriage with Shelby Grant, a pristine public image, and one-night affairs with Donahue. But Donahue was exhausted, even driven mad by being forced to witness the couple's intimacy in front of the media. In his diary, Donahue wrote, "I am not a shadow in his life, nor a supporting character in anyone's tragedy. He wanted me to be a silent lover, but I loved with all my heart, and that is something he would never forgive." Chad Everett maintained his exemplary facade until the very end. Even as his body was ravaged by lung cancer, he lay upright. Before closing his eyes for the last time, he instructed his descendants, "Don't let anyone destroy the image. Say nothing." The image of the perfect husband had eroded his soul. A nurse recalled that, amidst delirium caused by morphine, he would often mumble a man's name, one that sounded strikingly like a famous person. And somewhere, in Troy Donahue's memory, the old words still echoed. He never truly belonged to me, but I belonged to him in every single moment. Until one day, America's Prince quietly left the stage. No lights, no applause, only the sighs of the souls who had once lost their way in Hollywood. But this is absolutely not an act of revenge. Troy Donahue shocked Hollywood when he publicly revealed a staggering truth: the secret list of homosexual relationships he had experienced. That confession spoke on behalf of an entire generation of stars who had to live in silence, hiding behind the flawless facade that the film industry had imposed upon them. Within that list appeared illustrious names: the masculine icon, Rock Hudson; the lonely soul, Anthony Perkins; and hearts bound by circumstance, like Chad Everett and Tab Hunter. Even though their loves had once been concealed, avoided, or left unfinished, they all remain an irrefutable part of the truth in the history of American cinema. Perhaps it was Troy Donahue himself, a man who had lost everything simply for daring to love in the wrong era, who left humanity a kind of testament not written on paper but engraved deeply in memories that were both bitter and beautiful. It was a reminder that secret loves had existed, and that they deserved the right to love openly from the very beginning. Even knowing that memories could not alter history, Donahue still treasured recording each person's name in an old notebook. To him, those whom the press glorified as immortal icons were in reality just ordinary individuals yearning to live authentically as themselves. In September 2001, Troy Donahue breathed his last at the age of 65 after suffering 2 consecutive heart attacks. There was no grand funeral, no crowd of fans, nor a single Hollywood star to bid him farewell. Only a few old friends quietly lit incense, commemorating the man once hailed as the American dream, and the only person brave enough to preserve the secrets Hollywood had tried to bury for nearly a century. He departed in silence, yet even in his final moments, Troy Donahue remembered every person who had crossed his life, through a glance, through a choked voice, in a dream. Secret romances, hidden kisses, kindred spirits, all he carried with him to the grave, as a poignant reminder that some people were only allowed to love in the shadows. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this story belongs not only to Hollywood, but also to the narrative of freedom, courage, and the longing to be oneself.